Okay, this segment is about quilting. So I'm getting ready to quilt, and the first thing I need to do is make sure that I measure the length of the quilt, which I've already done. It's 68 inches, and the width comes to 53 inches. So I'm going to write these numbers down, 53 inches across. And then I want probably at least 3 to 4 inches all the way around for the backing fabric. So I'm figuring out how much backing fabric I need right now. So 53 inches, and then if let's add another 8 inches to give us 4 inches on the side. So that would be 61 inches, I think, across that way. And 68 inches long plus another 8 is 76, I think. 76 inches. So that, and what I'm going to do, so I have 2 coordinating fabrics, well, 3 in the collection. So you can use the stripe fabric if you want. We've got the beautiful Lebeau red fabric, or Sole, which is the blue. Now, both Sole and Lebeau are directional. So, and I am kind of particular about directional fabric. I want to keep it directional. So I'm going to need I'm going to need 2 pieces of fabric, because the width of the fabric, I'm going to have to piece it in order to get the appropriate width. And because it's directional, I want it to go lengthwise. So I'm going to need probably 76 inches long, and I'm going to need that twice. So it's quite a bit of fabric if I'm going to use one fabric. You can piece the background, you can do whatever you want. You can use a different type of fabric that doesn't require paying attention to the direction, but I want to be true to my French Provençal look. So once you have figured that out and selected your fabric, now I'm ready to cut and piece the background, and I will also cut my my batting. So I use an 80-20. I like really thin batting. So I will make my quilt sandwich with my backing that's been pieced, my batting, and the quilt top. And then I'm going to do some stitching in it, to some basting stitches, which are the long stitches that will just hold everything in place, because then I'll be working on my Q16 Bernina. So to quilt it. So that's the next step. I will get that done, and I'll check back in with you in just a minute. All right, I have here my pieced background. Now, of course, I still am going to need to trim the background, because it's wider than it needs to be. And there is a seam in it, down the middle. So I want my seam to be off center. I don't want it to be directly down the middle of the quilt. So I've let me show you. There's the seam right there. So here's the fabric for the back. Of course, make sure that you put the fabric laying out. And then I've got my doubled up batting. I'm only doing this because it comes doubled up, and this way I can get the length, right? And once I match it to the size of the background fabric, or backing fabric, then I'll trim everything. And I just laid the quilt top up here just to double check that I've given myself enough length. Remember, I just want a few inches on top and bottom. So I'm looking good. I think I can actually just trim it to the size of my table. So I'll trim my batting, and then trim off a little bit of I'll open up my batting and make my quilt sandwich again. So I'll be back in just a second. All right, so I have pieced my backing fabric. I've trimmed my batting to match the backing as far as length goes. And of course, when you piece 2 widths of fabric together, it's going to be way more than what we need. So now I'm just laying everything out, and I'm going to trim along the edge down there. and make sure that I've got, you know, 3 or 4 inches on the outside, that the backing fabric and the batting extend beyond the quilt top. Also make sure that your backing fabric is face down for your quilt sandwich, and that the direction of the print is the way you want it, the orientation that you want. So my quilt, the top is up here, so I make sure that my directional fabric is also aligned properly. Okay, so now I'm just smoothing this all out and making sure that the quilt top fits nicely on this. Amelia, will you come help me with this, and we'll just smooth this out nicely. Okay. Let's pull it down just a little bit. Lift it up while I pull it. Okay, take up the extra. There we go. An extra set of hands is really helpful at this point, as is a large cutting surface. So if you don't have the luxury of a big island in your studio, use your kitchen counter or a great big table. If all else fails, lay it out on the floor. Okay, so now I'm just going to trim this up and put some pins in it just so that I can take it over to my machine and do a basting stitch. And I'm just going to baste the heck out of it, because I will take those threads out after it's quilted. But the basting holds everything in place so that I don't have quilting that gets concentrated and makes the fabric skiwampus, right? So, all right, that's the next step, and I will get that done, and I'll see you over at my machine. Hi, okay, so here I am at the machine. Let me kind of tell you what I've done. In the last segment, I said I was going to do some basting stitches. I did some basting stitches, but I realized, you know what, this isn't doing any good. I need to make sure the quilt is more secure before I do basting stitches. And then, so I took it off my machine, took it back over to my flat surface, smoothed it all out, and just pinned the heck out of it with, I think they're called basting safety pins. So that's what I have in my quilt. I do have a few basting lines, but I'm not really depending on those to keep my quilt secure. So you can see this is a pretty big quilt for this machine. So I've rolled it up in the middle. I'm starting on the 2 roosters that are in the middle of the quilt. So I've already done one of the roosters. I'll show you a close-up of that shortly, but I wanted to talk about what I'm doing now. So first of all, the needles, I'm using the Schmetz Super Nonstick needle. Always start with a new, fresh needle in your machine. And this Q16 Bernina actually takes regular needles. So that's the needle that I'm using. You could also use a denim needle. And then I've been playing around with thread to experiment and see which thread works best. I started out with an 80-pound or 80 weight thread. And it just kept breaking. And then I wanted to just see what 100 weight would do. And again, just kept breaking. It's just, if you can break the thread too easily, it's not good for quilting through collage, is what I'm learning. So I went back to the thread that I normally use, which is the Isacord 40 weight thread. It's normally used for embroidery. It's really, really strong, 100% polyester. So that's what I'm using now. But even with this, I was having some issue with my thread breaking on this particular rooster. So, and this color works great. When I put the blue in, I'm like, what the heck? It kept breaking. So I took it off. I took it over to my my iron, steamed it really good, pressed it really good, and now it's working like a charm. So I guess I just probably hadn't pressed it well enough. So if you're having any problems with needles breaking, or excuse me, thread breaking, go ahead and steam it again. Give it another good steaming, and now it seems to be working like a dream. So just wanted to mention to you about those tips. I'm starting, the trickiest part really is the collage. So that's what I'm starting with. So I'm the way I'm stitching this, I'm doing kind of what I call doodle stitching on the design, just kind of mimicking feathers in that shape. So nothing really difficult, and I'll do a demonstration and also show you up close on the stitching what it looks like. And then when I get my rulers, I'm going to be using some rulers to get some really straight lines on the rest of it. And so I'll be combining ruler work with just mostly straight edge ruler work with free motion quilting. As always, I recommend dense quilting because we're dealing with all raw edges on these roosters. And I do want to be able to wash this quilt because I want to be able to use it. It's a large quilt. It's not something that I'll hang on a wall. Well, I might, I don't know, but I really want to be able to use it. So that's why the quilting becomes really super important. So those are my tips and tricks. And now you can just watch me for a minute and see how I'm doing the quilting on the rooster. And then in a short bit, I'll teach you a little bit more about what I'm doing with the ruler work. Okay, so here we go. It's going to get a little noisy. By the way, these are fantastic to use. They help me grip the fabric and move it underneath my needle. So let me put on my glasses so I can see. And here we go. All right, so I have been working I've put in a lot of hours now on this quilting. Let me just kind of tell you what the order of quilting has been and what I've learned along the way. So you might remember I was having some issues with my thread breaking. The other thing that I didn't mention is that I reduced the thread tension so that when I am quilting through Collage, I've loosened up the top thread. So that really helped. I think that was the main issue. So making sure that you've steamed it really good, make sure that the fusible web has been softened up and my thread tension is lower. So just experiment when you go to quilt. Make sure that you test and kind of those are the things that you need to think about if you have any issues. So what I've done is I did the roosters and then I put the coordinating color of thread in. So I would do all the greenery around all of these things, and then I'd switch to yellow and I'd do all the yellow flowers and the red. I did doodle stitching on these as well. So they're pretty detailed, but they're sketchy. So it didn't require a lot of precision. They're pretty sketchy, but I have been pretty careful to really focus on all of the details on the fabric. And then I did the backgrounds. So all of the background behind the roosters has been quilted. That's a little looser. I can now still go back and fill in if I want to do more vertical lines or whatever. I did a meander stitch on 3 of them. And anyway, you'll see the whole thing shortly. But I wanted to let you know I've got my ruler. I've been practicing using my ruler to get straight edges on this, and I think I'm getting, well, I know I'm getting much better. I have kind of practiced on this quilt. I had to unstitch a lot of things if I kind of went off the line, but now I think I've got it. So one thing that was really helpful for me too with these rulers was to put grippy tape on the back of them so that when they're on the fabric, they're not slipping and sliding on the fabric. So now I'm just going to demonstrate what I'm doing with on some of these pieces with using my ruler. Okay, here we go. Get my gloves on. And I'm just going to demonstrate how to do this. So I like to line up my needle so I know right where it's going to drop into and then pull the bottom thread up and out. And I like to put that back down in there so that it holds everything in place. Now I'm going to just line up turn it onto the BSR, which is a stitch regulator, Bernina stitch regulator. And the one thing I do have to be kind of careful of is that I need to make sure that the weight of this quilt doesn't make my fabric shift. So I'll kind of hold this up a little bit. And now I can push start. And I'm going to do a jump stitch here. Put that back down so I can make sure I get it in the right spot. There. And then I'll finish this line. Whoops. There we go. Then I'm going to line the ruler back up on the stitch line that I just did. Make sure that is where it needs to go. Do a jump stitch here. So the rulers really give me a lot of precision, and it looks like it becomes kind of tedious, which it's just precision work, but I think that precision is gonna really look great on this quilt. So line that up with my last stitch line, and I am now obviously you only need to use a ruler if you're quilting on a machine that's a free motion machine. Whoops. Okay, done with that little section. Now I'm going to just cut all of those little jump stitches. So that is the ruler work that I'm doing. and I'm just gonna keep going on this, and I'll check back with you when I'm finishing up. I'll be doing the borders shortly, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, the quilt is finished. Let me talk about each little section that I quilted. Now, obviously you don't have to quilt it the way I did, but I am going to explain what I did, and I'm going to have Amelia come close with the camera so that you can see some close-ups. So you can see that I've done some doodle stitching, what I call doodle stitching, and let me just kind of demonstrate that, what I mean by that. So if I were to, I like doodle stitching because it's very forgiving. It doesn't require a lot of expertise. I don't consider myself an expert. And the way I think of doodle stitching is if I were going to just use a pencil and just kind of sketch, this is what my stitch lines look like. Okay, so on each of the roosters, that's kind of what I did. You can see that they're close enough together, those stitch lines become close enough together so that all the little pieces are tacked down with the quilting. And then the other area that I did doodle stitching was on all the little flower elements that are made to look like they've been fussy cut. So you can see how, again, I just did the doodle stitching there. The background of each block I did in a unique pattern. So this I followed the design of the fabric, and this is a doodle stitching just all over meander. And then each section of the quilt, I just used my ruler, did some ruler work. Sometimes it was really dense, other times it was a little looser. And then I did the border with just straight line stitching. I put this on my domestic machine, and then this area is just a beautiful kind of loop-de-loo meander. And then I ended up putting, I cut my binding strip just 2 inches. I wanted a little bit smaller binding than a 1/2 inch because there's just so much going on, and I didn't want to add one more overpowering element. I think this just finishes it really nicely, and I'm really happy with the way the binding looks. So there's the finished quilt. I hope that you'll join me next week for a live Q&A, and you can ask all the questions that you might have.